So we start with the punctuation, the grammar, the sentence structure, vocabulary, and then we move on to the long passage for reading comprehension. And then we do our study words along with etymology. So let's begin. From word cross to crossword craze. In the early 1900s, the fun section of the New York World, a Sunday supplement that presented puzzles to entertain the newspaper's readers. Okay, the way this sentence stands right now, it's not a sentence. There is no verb. You need a verb here. In the early 1900s, the fun section of the New York World, that would be the subject, right? This is a prepositional phrase. This is the main body of the sentence. And the subject is the fun section of the New York World, just modifies fun section. So the fun section, blank, a Sunday supplement that presented puzzles. So if you look at your choices, no change is clearly wrong because there's no verb here. Aha, there's a verb, was, and there's no verb here or here. So it has to be be, okay? So what this would read is the New York World was a Sunday supplement that presented puzzles to entertain the newspaper's readers. One day in 1913, the section's editor's Arthur Wynne was asked by his superior to create a new puzzle. Okay. One day in 1913 should be one phrase. You shouldn't be separating with a comma because it's naming a specific time, one day in 1913. So if you do need to separate this out, the comma should go here, not here. One day in 1913, comma, the section's editor. Now you're stating the name of the editor, so you can separate that out by commas. So there should be a comma here and here. So this is clearly wrong. So what is the choice here that would conform to the requirements? Choice G, one day in 1913, comma, the section's editor, comma, Arthur Wynne, comma, was asked by his superior to create a new puzzle. So G is the correct answer to two. Inspired by a game called Magic Squares from his childhood, comma, Wynne drew up a variation that used a diamond-shaped grid with numbered squares in rows and columns. Okay. Inspired by a game called Magic Squares from his childhood, comma. This is grammatically correct. This is a basically a subordinate clause. The main sentence is Wynne drew up, and here we go. This is a verb, drew up, to draw up something. So this stands as a verb, a variation that used a diamond-shaped grid. So what would be better than this? Let's go over and look at the choices. He was getting inspiration from a game called Magic Squares from his childhood when he grew up. That's a run-on sentence. He found inspiration from, again, this is a sentence, and you're just adding another sentence to it. It makes it a run-on sentence. He became inspired. Again, you're going to have a run-on sentence. This is not a sentence. It's a subordinate clause. So it allows this to be the main sentence. All of these others are sentences in and of themselves. So they will definitely conflict with the main sentence. So you want to leave it as is. So the right answer to 3 is A, no change. Inspired by a game called Magic Squares from his childhood, Wynne drew up. Now, is drew up correct versus drew down, drew over, or drew to? Okay. Well, this is an idiomatic expression. It's a very common expression. And this is correct as it is. You draw up plans. You draw up things. You create things by drawing them up. Okay. You don't draw them down. You don't draw them over. You write them down. Okay. You go over them. Okay. But the correct form of this verb, this colloquial verb, is to draw up. Wynne drew up a variation that used diamond-shaped grid with numbered squares. So the right answer is no change, okay? The puzzle was to be filled in with the answers to clues that corresponded to the numbered squares. He named his new creation a word cross, period. After the puzzle's debut in December, requests from readers came pouring in for more word crosses, period. Okay. This is a prepositional phrase. It needs to be separated by a comma. You can capitalize December because it's a month of the year, but this is not the end of the sentence. This is just a prepositional phrase. You have to separate it by a comma. This should not be capitalized because it's not the beginning of a new sentence. Requests from readers came pouring in. So the right answer here would be the comma here, and then the small case R, starting requests. So the right answer to number 5 is C, okay? Some readers even submitted puzzles of their own. That's perfectly fine sentence. Good. Okay, let's move on. Wynne began including a word cross in his section every week, usually one he wrote himself, but sometimes a reader's submission. So it looks to me like this is a comma. Is that a comma or a period? Oh, actually, it's a period, isn't it? Okay, so if you make this a period, this that follows is not a sentence. So you can't do that. This can't be the end of the sentence. Wynne began including a word cross in his section every week. This needs to be some punctuation other than a period. Now, we can look at what the choices are, and usually one he wrote himself, but sometimes a reader's submission. Okay, you don't really need the word and, because and implies something new and different, but actually usually is modifying what the phrase before it. Okay, the word cross. So and implies that he's doing something else, and he's not. So this would be wrong. Week dash. Okay, a dash can be used. Usually one he wrote himself, but sometimes a reader's submission. That's possible, right? Because you're not ending the sentence there. Week, and then you have a semicolon, and what follows needs to be a sentence, right? It needs to be a complete sentence. Usually one he wrote himself, but sometimes it's not. So semicolon is wrong, and is incorrect. No change is wrong, right? Because there's no period, is not the end of a sentence. So the only right answer is the dash. So 6 has to be H, okay? Eventually, the puzzles became known as crosswords. By 1915, reader submissions arrived in such great numbers that Martha Petherbridge, Wynne's secretary, began assisting Wynne in managing and editing the puzzles. Okay, you never have a comma after that, unless it's something like, that, said Jim, is the right answer. So this comma is inappropriate, all right? But Martha Pembridge is named, and then her name is basically elaborated on. It's the same person, Wynne's secretary. So it's appropriate to separate this out with commas, but this comma is incorrect. Okay, so we got to find something that conforms to what we want. And if you look at B, okay, that Martha Pedbridge, Wynne's secretary, separated by commas, no comma here, began assisting Wynne in managing and editing the puzzle. So the right answer to 7 is B. Okay, let's move on. Crossword devotees would complain if there was even a small formatting flaw or factual error in the puzzles. So Petherbridge checked carefully for typographical and content errors prior to printing. So it says here, if the writer were to delete the underlined portion of the paragraph, formatting flaw or factual error, it would just read it as follows. Crossword devotees would complain if there was even a small error in the puzzles, but it wouldn't give you the specific error, the detailed error that the readers were upset about, okay? That the crossword devotees were upset about. So you want more information about what upsets them. So what would be missing is an indication of the importance of the newspaper, specific details that help the reader understand how seriously crossword enthusiasts took the puzzles. Yeah, details that matter to the crossword enthusiasts. So 8 is definitely G, okay? An explanation of why the author is interested in crossword puzzles is totally irrelevant. An indication of readers' frustration with Martha, no, that's irrelevant as well. So essentially, that adds some detail that really is helpful for we, the reader, to understand what the crossword devotees are looking for. Okay. So Petherbridge checked carefully. Carefully is an adverb that modifies the verb checked. You could put it before or after. You could say Petherbridge carefully checked for typographical errors. I prefer this structure, checked carefully. but the adverb has to either come before or after the verb. For typographical and content errors prior to printing, okay? So this seems like it's fairly correct. Then let's take a look at what the other choices are. Prior to printing, checked for typographical and content errors. So Petherbridge, prior to printing, checked for typographical and content errors carefully. So here's the deal. Petherbridge is doing the checking. You don't want the verb to be separated from the noun. Petherbridge checked. If you stick prior to printing in between it, you're separating the verb from the subject. Okay, and that's not appropriate. So B is wrong. Okay, carefully, comma, checked for errors prior to printing. This comma doesn't belong here. You don't separate an adverb from a verb with a comma, so you know that's wrong. Checked, comma, prior to printing, typographical and content errors carefully. This is basically a series of short phrases that are inappropriate. This is much more sensible. Petherbridge checked carefully for typographical and content errors, okay? She didn't check prior to printing. She checked for typographical and content errors. So the flow of this makes more sense. You've got the subject, you've got the verb, you've got the object of the verb in that order, and that's what you want, okay? So the right answer basically for 9 is to just leave it alone, no change. She also established firm rules for crossword layouts, including the introduction of square-shaped grids. That's perfectly good sentence. By the 1920s, comma, the craze for crosswords went far beyond the World's Fun supplement. Songwriters released tunes with crossword-related lyrics. Fashionable women wore crossword-decorated dresses, period. In line, comma, fans of crossword crowds waited at the New York Public Library to use dictionaries to search for puzzle answers. So this sentence, okay, should have a subject and a verb. The verb is weighted, but the subject should precede the verb. So the subject is fans. See it? Fans of crosswords. You can have the prepositional phrase modifying fans, but fans should be the first part of the sentence. Fans of crosswords would be reasonable. But when you look at the structure of this whole sentence, fans of crosswords in crowds waited in line. Very, very awkward. Fans waited in line. Take a look at J. Crowds of crossword fans waited in line. So here you have fans right before the verb, the subject and the verb. Crowds of crossword fans, the crowds waited. The fans waited in line. So the right answer, the best structure for this would be J, okay? And the way it would read, okay, would be crowds of crossword fans waited in line at the New York Public Library. Where were they waiting in line? At the New York Public Library. So the order of things here makes perfect sense. And this is the only proper construction. J is the right answer. To use dictionaries to search for puzzle answers. And a fledgling publishing company became an immediate success when, in 1924, it released a smash. Okay, a fledgling publishing company, you've already named your subject, so your pronoun has to refer back to that specific subject, okay? Themselves, no, this is a singular subject, so themselves makes no sense. Them, no, it's plural. One, it doesn't refer specifically back to the fledgling publishing company. The only pronoun that lets you know you're referring back to this company is it. So this reads, so basically you want to, essentially for 12, you do no change. And a fledgling publishing company became an immediate success when in 1924 it released a smash hit. Here's a colon, the first book-length collection of crossword puzzles. What's the hit? The first book-length collection of crossword puzzles. You've got a colon there, okay? And what do we always say about a colon? You use it for two things. Use it to precede a list, or you use it to restate or emphasize the thing that came prior to the colon. So in this case, it's a restatement or an emphasis. It released a smash hit. Hit is the thing. What is the thing? The first book-length collection of crossword puzzles. So 12 is correct as is. It should be no change. Okay? If you look at the other choices, a semicolon is wrong because this is not a sentence, what comes after it. Hit the, you need punctuation here. You can't just have it blank. Hit, period. What follows is not a sentence. So all of these are wrong. The only right answer is no change. Okay? And that's the appropriate use of a colon in this setting. Let us move on. Through the 1920s was the time and age when crosswords were at the peak of the public's obsession with crosswords. Crosswords were at the peak of the public's obsession with crosswords. So you're repeating crosswords twice. The puzzles and their cryptic clues continue to captivate audiences. This is a run-on sentence. It makes no sense at all. So you don't want to repeat crosswords twice. You want to find a much more succinct, a shorter, more concise way of saying that the height of the popularity of crosswords was the 1920s. So let's look at the choices. We could leave it as it is, which is terrible. B, though the 1920s signified that crosswords had reached the top peak, the 1920s don't signify anything. It's just an era. Eras can't signify anything, okay? So that can't be right, okay? Indicated and signaled the peak. Well, the 1920s don't indicate anything, right? It's just a period of time. And so this is incorrect. Marked, aha. Take a look. The 1920s, through the 1920s, marked the height, okay, of the public's obsession with crosswords. Though the 1920s marked the height of the public's obsession with crosswords, which is a fine dependent clause, though the 1920s marked the height of the public's obsession with crosswords, period. And now we need to say something else. The puzzles and their cryptic clues continued to captivate audiences. And that makes sense. That's grammatically correct. In other words, it was more popular back then. It achieved its peak of popularity, but it still continues to be of interest to people today. So this sentence makes sense logically. So given that all the choices are true, which one provides most effective and logical conclusion to the essay? Although the 1920s marked the height of the public's obsession with crosswords, publication of the New York World finally ceased in 1931. It's a non sequitur. It's not talking about crosswords, it's talking about the newspaper. So that is completely wrong. Puzzles today often use clues that depend on puns and wordplay. That doesn't relate to the fact that it was popular before, very popular before, and still popular today. This contrast is important, and this is just off topic. These puzzles are published across the world and in many languages. Again, off topic. The only one that really addresses the popularity appropriately is what's here right now. It used to be at the height of its popularity, but it's still popular. That's really what the sentence is saying. So 14 needs to be no change. It's good the way it is. Once you change 13 to D, then you can just leave 14 as it is. And that sentence is perfectly correct. Okay? Now, question 15. Suppose the writer's primary purpose had been to inform the reader about the origin of the modern crossword puzzle. Would this essay accomplish that purpose? Yes, because the essay tells how Arthur Wynne became a world-famous crossword writer and inspired many crossword fans. Yes, because the essay describes both the inspiration, remember how he became inspired by the game of Magic Squares, for and the development of the crossword puzzle. This is a good answer. No, both the no's are wrong. Because this essay, this little passage, talks about the origin and development of the crossword puzzle. So it has to be yes, but this yes is much more descriptive of what the passage actually does. So the right answer to 15 is B. Okay? And now we'll move on to the long passage. And there's two passages, one by Marita Golden, and the other one by Larry King. Writers are always headed or looking for home. Home is the first sentence, questing into the craggy terrain of imagination. Home is the final sentence, polished, perfected, nailed down. I am an American writer, comma, and so my sense of place is fluid. It means it's ever changing, ever shifting. There she even says it. The spaciousness of this land reigns and pushes against the borders of self-censorship and hesitation. I have claimed at one point or other every place as my home. So she's moving around a lot. Like their creator, my fictional characters reject the notion of life lived on automatic pilot. Who's their creator? She is. Marita Golden. They're her fictional characters. She created them. Like their creator, my fictional characters reject the notion of life lived on automatic pilot. In other words, without making conscious choices. The most important people in my books see life as a flame, something that when lived properly bristles and squirms, even as it glows. In other words, something is very much alive, nothing that lives in a dull automatic life. In the autobiography, Migrations of the Heart, the heroine, who just happened to be me, right, because it's an autobiography, she's writing it about her own life, came of age in Washington, D.C. She grew up in Washington and began the process of becoming an adult person, in other words, maturing everywhere else. So she grew up to a certain age, probably in her teens in Washington, then she started traveling. If you sell your first piece of writing in Manhattan, give birth to your only child in Lagos, which is in Nigeria, in Africa, experience Paris in the spring with someone you love, Paris, France, and return to Washington after 13 years of self-imposed exile to write the Washington novel nobody else had, and you thought you never would. Tickets, visas, lingua franca means the language of diplomacy, will all become irrelevant. Okay, so she's saying, here I am back in Washington after all these travels, all these experiences, and I'm writing a novel about Washington, D.C. But I'm writing it with the perspective of someone that's lived in many, many different places. Okay? When all places fingerprint the soul, every place that you live has an impact on you. Which impact is judged to be the strongest? In my novel, A Woman's Place, one woman leaves America to join a liberation struggle in Africa. All right, there you go. In Long Distance Life, that's another book she wrote, Naomi Johnson, her character that she made up, flees 1930s North Carolina and comes up south to Washington, D.C., in other words, to the upper part of the South, to find and make her way. 30 years later, her daughter returns to that complex, unpredictable geography and is sculpted like some unexpected work of art by the civil rights movement. So she's just saying that this is what her book's about, a woman that traveled from Carolina to Washington, and then a daughter that went back to Carolina during the civil rights movement. I am a Washington writer who keeps one bag in the closet packed just in case. So she's ready to travel at any time to experience something new. I am an American who knows the true color of the nation's culture and its heart, a stubborn, wrenching rainbow. I am Africa's yearning stepchild, unforgotten, misunderstood, necessary. Writers are always headed or looking for home. The best of us embrace and rename it when we get there. So she's saying basically these are all different facets of her. She's a Washingtonian, she's an American, she's an African, she's a writer. She has all these different identities that kind of meld together. And she says that writers are always looking for home. They're looking for how they can best portray their ideas, um, and characterize the places where they choose to write about. Right. Now we get another guy's perspective on places. If you live long enough, and I have, your sense of place or your place becomes illusionary. In other words, doesn't exist anymore. In a changing world, our special places are not exempt. The rural Texas, the farming Texas, where I grew up in the 1930s and 40s, simply does not exist anymore. It exists only in memory or on pages or stages where a few of us have attempted to lock it in against the ravages of time. In other words, it exists in fictional writing or historical writing, or it exists in plays that people perform. But that's the only place it exists. The old time Texas is long since disappeared and has been replaced by modern Texas. And it is, of course, a losing battle. In other words, you can't keep the memory of a place alive forever. Attempting to rhyme my work of an earlier Texas with the realities of today's urban tangle Texas, I sometimes feel that I'm writing about pharaohs. In other words, I'm writing about ancient history, the part of Texas that is long gone. My friend Larry McMurtry a few years ago stirred up a Texas tornado with an essay in which he charged that Texas writers stubbornly insist on writing of old Texas, the Texas of myth and legend, while avoiding our responsibility to write of the complexities of modern Texas. So he was basically in this essay saying that writers are not addressing the modern realities of Texas. They keep going back to the old world Texas when they write. Hardly had the anguished cries of the wounded faded away. In other words, other writers were angry at him for saying that on the Texas wind until Mr. McMurtry himself delivered a novel called Lonesome Dove. They made a movie called Lonesome Dove based on the novel. A cracking good yarn, meaning a good story, if a bit long on cowboy myths and frontier legends. So even McMurtry, who basically chastised his fellow writers for not writing about modern Texas, wrote a story about the old Texas. And it was decidedly short of skyscraper observations or solutions to urban riddles. In other words, it didn't address Texas's modern realities. But not only did Larry McMurtry have a perfect right to change his mind, I'm delighted that he did. It was probably a really good book. Okay. I spent my formative years in Texas, my childhood growing up, my first 17 years, before random relocation arranged by the U.S. Army. Uncle Sam sent me to Queens, New York, which is a borough of New York City. I must admit, Queens failed to grow on me. He really didn't like it. But from it, I discovered Manhattan, which did grow on me, and I vowed to return to Manhattan. And one day I did. One day did. But before that, in 1954, at the age of 25, I came to Washington, D.C. to work in Congress. So he grew up in Texas, moved to Queens because of the Army, got to know Manhattan. Then he went to Washington, D.C. to work in Congress. So he was a congressman, lived in Washington, D.C. Remember, he lived in Washington, D.C., and so did she. Both of them lived in Washington, D.C. New York and Washington offered themselves as measuring sticks against the only world I had previously known, Texas. They permitted me to look at my natural habitat, Texas, with fresh eyes, and even spurred me to leave my native place. Okay. So he's gotten a different perspective on Texas. I've now tarried here in what I call the Misty East for almost 40 years. So he's living on the East Coast, either Texas or Washington, Manhattan, we're not sure. This has sometimes led to a confusion of place. I strangely feel like a Texan, okay, in New York and Washington. When I return home to Texas, I feel like a New Yorker or Washingtonian. So he doesn't quite belong anywhere. When he's in New York, he's a Texan. When he's in Texas, he's a New Yorker. So it's kind of like, when you think about an immigrant who comes from another country, they're not quite American, but then after many, many years, they're not quite what they were when they left their native country. They're somewhere in between. So if my native place has been guilty of change, then so have I. So places change, and so do people. Yet when I set out to write, there's little of ambivalence. The story speaks patterns and values that pop out are from an earlier time and of my original place. In other words, he's still writing like a Texas guy. I consider myself a guide to the recent past. In an age when the past seems not much value, I think that is not a bad function for the writer. So again, talking about the purpose of the writer, she does the same thing. A writer's purpose is to look for home, to embrace and rename home, to change somehow home with their writing, with their art. And he says the same thing. A writer's job is to elicit the past and make people understand it. So they're both talking about the purpose of writing, but they have a bit of a different perspective on it. Okay, good. So let's move on here. Question 1, according to passage A, that's the woman, for the author of the passage, being an American writer means that her sense of place is deeply personal, constantly shifting, tied to her family, somewhat irrelevant. So she says very point blank in the very beginning, fluid, ever shifting. So the right answer to that question 1 is constantly shifting. B, 2, which of the following statements regarding the passage author's Washington novel is best supported by passage A? Remember, she traveled first and then she came back. She wrote the novel about people she met while traveling. Doesn't say that. It says that she traveled, then she came back and wrote the Washington novel that no one else would write. She could not finish writing it. No, she did write it. She patterned it after other novels about Washington. No, it was the novel that no one else wrote. It was unique. She thought that she would never write it. Well, in parentheses, it does say that. To write the Washington novel nobody else had, parentheses, and you thought you never would, close parentheses. See that? So she basically never thought she would ever finish it, but she did do it. So the right answer is she thought that she would never write it, but she actually did write it. Based on how, so Jay is right. Based on how she presents herself in the third paragraph, lines 32 to 39, the author of passage J can best be described as someone who overcame many obstacles, embraces the various elements of her identity, gets inspiration from people and everyday things, found a place to live that suits her personality. So I would say probably the right answer here is B, before we even look at the paragraph that she's talking about. But we're going to go back and look at the paragraph and see what she talks about. Does she talk about various elements of her identity? Okay, let's go to line 32 and see what she talks about. I am Washington. Yeah, I'm a Washington person. I'm an American. I'm an African. There you go. She's talking about she embraces various aspects of her identity. So the right answer to 3 is B. 4, the losing battle, in quotes, in line 47 of passage B most clearly refers to the passage author's efforts to inspire a new generation of Texas authors to write about their home state, understand the lives of those who lived in the 30s and 40s in rural Texas, preserve 1930s and 1940s rural Texas through writing, find new ways to write about his childhood. Preserve. It's a losing battle, right? He says we try to keep it on stage and on page, but it's a losing battle. We're not going to be able to do it. Against the ravages of time, and it is, of course, a losing battle. It exists only in memory or on the pages or stages where a few of us writers have attempted to lock it in against the ravages of time. In other words, prevent it from disappearing. and it's a losing battle. So they can't preserve it. So the right answer to 4 is preserve the 1930s and 40s. It's a losing battle. They can't do it. Okay. 5, in the context of passage B, when the passage author states, I sometimes feel that I am writing about pharaohs. Pharaohs are ancient history, right? So he's comparing writing about pharaohs to writing about the old Texas, which he considers to be long gone or quote unquote ancient history. He most nearly means that he feels as if he's writing about a well-known subject, an influential time period, powerful tyrants, the distant past. D. Pharaohs come from the distant past, and he feels like the old Texas is the distant past. 6, based on passage B, McMurtry's comment that Texas authors write about old Texas too much was received with what can be described as, remember, the other writers were angry. It was a volcano. Ambivalence, no. Indignation, yeah, that's possible, but he hadn't written a Lonesome Dove yet when he wrote that essay. Okay, because they couldn't have thought of him as a hypocrite because they hadn't read his Lonesome Dove. So even though this looks right, G is wrong. Okay, if you look at the sequence of events, he wrote the essay first, people got mad, then later on, he wrote Lonesome Dove. Displeasure, yeah, that makes sense. Many writers openly disagreed with McMurtry's suggestion. Yeah, that's the volcano, other writers expressing themselves. So that's a correct answer. Surprise. They didn't know that he cared about Texas literature. Why would they not know that? No, it doesn't say that in the passage. So the only right answer here is H to 6. Okay. 7. As it is used in line 85, the word fancy most nearly means I fancy myself. Right? Remember that? 85? I fancy myself a guide. I consider myself a guide. A is the correct answer. That's a different way of saying consider. Right? You can use fancy as an adjective, but when you use it as a verb, it means you consider yourself. I fancy myself. It's a very common expression. But you could say, boy, that dress is very fancy. That's a different meaning, right? It's used as an adjective. This is a verb. Okay, 8. It can reasonably be inferred, concluded from the passages that regarding its effect on their lives, both passage authors would agree that leaving their native places led to their deciding to move away permanently, influenced them to write about visiting new places, changed their perspectives about home, showed them the value of family. H is clearly the right answer. In the case of the woman writer, she traveled to all these different places, Lagos and Paris, and then she came back to Washington, right? And wrote the Great Washington novel. So she had changed her perspective about home because of all the traveling that she did. And then in the same way, the guy from Texas, right? He grew up in Texas, but then he went to New York and went to DC, and it changed the way that he looked at his home in Texas. So that would be the correct answer, change their perspectives about home. 9, the passages most strongly indicate that in their various moves, both passage authors have resided in Washington, D.C. That's true. She grew up there and he was there as a congressman. Written novels while living in New York. It never says in the passage where they were when they wrote the novels. Relocated because of the military. She did not. He did, but she did not. Lived in places outside of the United States. She did, but he did not. He was in Texas and then Washington and New York. She's the one that went to Europe and Africa. Okay, so the right answer there is they both lived in DC at one time. Which of the following statements best compares the concluding lines of the passages? Okay, both passages end with the authors describing how they see their roles as writers. Yeah, remember they talk about a writer should do this, a writer should do that. Both of them use the term writer at the end. Writers are always headed or looking for home. The best of us writers, embrace and rename it when we get there. And then he says, he talks about writers too. In an age when the past seems not much value, I think that it is not a bad function for the writer. See what I'm saying? So both of them are talking about the writer. And when you look at that choice, both passages end with the authors describing how they see their role as a writer. That's a good answer. Both passages end with the authors emphasizing the importance that history has for writers. No, not really. The author of passage A describes her characters, whereas the author of B emphasizes the value of home. Well, you know, that's not how it ends. That's not how it ends. It ends with this discussion of what being a writer means to them. The author of passage A describes her approach to starting new books, whereas the author of passage B explains why his sense of place is illusory. He starts with that, he doesn't end with it. So that's not what happens at the end either. So the only right answer is F. Both passages end with the authors describing how they see their roles as writers. Okay? And now we're going to stop share and we're going to move on to our vocabulary because we love it. It's our favorite thing. We got some good words tonight. All right. Let's start out with an interesting word, craggy. Not cranky, but craggy. What does it mean to be craggy?
A rough and uneven surface.
Yes, that's correct. You can refer to a landscape as craggy, a mountainside as craggy, and a face. Somebody has a craggy face, and like an older guy with deep creases in his face. Okay, you can use the word craggy in all those settings. But you're right, it means rough and uneven, usually with like, indentations and elevations, things like that. Okay, bristle. Now, bristle is an interesting word. What does it mean?
Isn't it a short, stiff hair?
Yeah, when it's a noun, the bristles on his cheek were short and stiff. Yeah. When it's a verb, it means that when you're bristling or your hair is bristling, it means it's standing up. And it usually means you're angry or scared. Like the people say, oh, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. You could say, the hair on his neck was bristling. So that's a verb, right? The other meaning of the verb is to be full of or covered with. So you could say the porcupine was bristling with needles. He was all covered over with needles. So remember, you have bristle as a noun, which is a short, stiff hair. Bristle in two verb forms. One means for the hair to stand up, and the other means to be totally covered by something. Okay? So understand the different ways that you can use the word bristle. Squirm. What does it mean to squirm?
You twist side by side as a result of discomfort.
Yeah, to wriggle or twist the body. Now, a baby can squirm because they don't want to sit in one place. Take a baby to a symphony performance. Take a 9-month-old to a symphony performance. See how long they sit still. They're going to start squirming, right? But you're right. Some people squirm when they are embarrassed. That's one reason why people squirm. So you can say, he was on stage and he felt so uncomfortable, he was squirming. So it can refer specifically to embarrassment, but it can also just be like a baby squirming. Okay. Ravage, to ravage something. It's not a very good thing.
To cause severe damage to.
Yeah, exactly. To cause extensive, severe damage. They ravaged the landscape with their oil drilling, ripped up all the trees, polluted the rivers, left huge holes in the ground. They ravaged the landscape. Okay, to shirk something.
To neglect a responsibility.
Yeah, we're always saying, the parents are always saying to the kids, don't shirk your responsibilities, clean your room and vacuum the floor. Stop shirking your responsibilities, do your homework. Stop avoiding or neglecting a duty that is your responsibility. Don't shirk, accept the responsibility and do it. Okay, to evince. Evince is a good word.
Isn't
To
it to isn't it to like reveal something?
It is. It's to reveal the presence of something or to show evidence of something. His angry letter evinced his agitation. The letter exposed it, showed evidence of it, evinced it. So that is a good word. And we're going to actually use that word for our etymology because it has an interesting background. Exhort. What does it mean to exhort?
strongly urge to do something.
Yeah, he exhorted the crowd to run into the Capitol building. He strongly urged them, encouraged them to do something. He exhorted the children to hurry up and finish their dinner, strongly urging them to do it. An exhortation is like a strong request. Okay, and you don't pronounce the H, it's exhort. It's not exhort, it's exhort. The H is silent. Execrable. Execrable. That's a hard word to pronounce. The emphasis is not on the ubble, it's on the X. Execrable. Okay? What is something that's execrable?
Extremely bad or unpleasant.
Yeah, say this cheap wine was execrable. It was horrible. It was disgusting. It was really unpleasant. Something you really detest. And actually, we're going to use that word as well in our etymology. Exigent. What is something that's exigent?
Demanding.
Yeah, pressing and demanding. It has to be done right away. The need for signing a budget was exigent. We got to get it done. Let's get it done. You can't wait. Okay. And expedient sounds like Expedia, that travel agency. That's probably where they got the name. But what is it when something is expedient?
Providing an easy way to do something.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean the best way. That's the important thing. It's the maybe convenient, maybe practical, maybe the quickest way. But sometimes it's improper. It's not the proper way to do things. He was always looking for an expedient solution rather than solving the problem in the proper way. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're doing a great job. It's not like ingenious. An ingenious solution is a great thing. An expedient solution, it means you're cutting corners. Okay? For the sake of expediency, I have decided not to do the entire paper, but only part of it. There you have it. Okay? Now, our etymology, execrable. This is a great word. So let me use my arrow here and show you. Execrable. Okay? Now, this is a cool word because the X means out of or away from. And believe it or not, the crabble part, the root of the word, comes from the Latin word sacrare. And sacrare, S-A-C-R-A-R-E, is to devote, to make holy, to make immortal. Sacrare is the verb that the word sacred comes from. So something that's out of devotion or out of being made holy is something you don't like. Okay? And a better form of this to explain it is to execrate. C-R-A-T-E. To execrate is to curse something, to detest it utterly. And again, X away from, sacrate, away from making something holy. Again, going back to the Latin root of sacrare. So the difference between execrate and consecrate. When you consecrate, con is with, that means you make something or declare something to be holy. So execrate is the opposite of consecrate. In the Catholic service, they consecrate the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. They make it holy. That's the ultimate transformation of the bread and wine into the body and blood. The transubstantiation, I believe they call it. And that's the consecration of the bread and wine, making it a holy objects. The opposite of execration, which is to say, is to take away the holiness. Ex versus con. And again, the root sacrare from the Latin, which is to devote, to make holy. And of course, we get the word sacred from the Latin sacrare, something that is sacred, right? Highly respected, maybe immortal, holy, special, sacred. There's another word, desecrate. To desecrate, D-E-S-E-C-R-A-T-E. D means to take away from. Desecrate, to take away from the holiness of something. So you could say to treat a holy thing with disrespect, to desecrate it. So you have execrate, to curse or to hate. Consecrate, to make sacred or to make holy, and desecrate, to treat a holy thing as if it were not holy. They desecrated the altar by throwing garbage on it. Okay? And all of it coming from that Latin root, sacrare, which means sacred, holy. Okay? Something you could devote yourself to. Okay, good. Now, our second word is evince. We love evince, okay, because it's a bizarre evolution of this word. Evincere in Latin, Evincere, okay, means to conquer, to overcome, to subdue, to vanquish. Okay, from the Latin. Evincere means the same thing as vincere in Latin, which is to have victory over someone. Okay, but somewhere along the line, in the 16th century, in the English language, the meaning of the word evince became to elicit proof by an argument, to expose or prove. So when you evince, you're exposing something, you're proving something, rather than conquering. So even though this root comes from the Latin word for conquering or subduing or overcoming, the word itself changed in meaning from a conquering act to an act of exposure or proof. Okay? This is where words' meaning changed over time. And if you look at the word evict, E-V-I-C-T, what does it mean to evict someone? It comes from the same root, vincere, but in Middle English, it branched off and became to recover property by a legal process, to throw someone out of the apartment because they didn't pay their rent. You own the apartment, they didn't pay their rent, you evict them. Okay? So the word evince and the word evict have a common origin in evincere, but both of them are an evolution of that meaning. One evolved to mean to show or to prove or to expose. The other one to take legal action and recover property from someone. Evince and evict. Both of them coming from evincere in Latin. Fascinating, right, how words evolve. Okay, guys, we're all set. We're all done. Any questions? All right, remember, you want to use these words in a sentence. You want to memorize their meaning. It's very important that you don't just let this opportunity slip by. Make these a part of your vocabulary. All right, we'll see you next Tuesday. God bless everyone. Take care.